The most anticipated card of the season has come out. Let's take a look at Prowler in Marvel Snap. Prowler is a 3/4 with an on-reveal ability that adds 2 Thieves Tools to your hand. If a card moved on the previous turn, those Thieves Tools cost 0. Tool number 1 is Flight Harness, which gives the card with the highest power at the location you play it +1 power and moves it to the right. Hello, Human Torch. Number 2 is Remote Mines, which afflicts the strongest 2 characters on your opponent's side of the board at the location that it's played at with -2 power. And number 3, Vibro Shot Gauntlets gives your highest power card at the location that it's played +2 power and gives you 1 energy next turn. Prowler is in a really interesting spot because move mid-range type stuff has sort of been the story of the season. I think you could argue that the big move Heimdall deck is kind of a move mid-range deck, and there are things that this card can do in there. But largely, where Prowler ends up fitting in are mostly decks that care a lot about skills and not decks that care a lot about move. And that means that this card's best friend is almost always going to be Werewolf by Night, which can both satisfy the condition of having a card move, but also scales very heavily with additional skills. Other cards that scale very well with skills are the Zombie package with Zombie Scarlet Witch, getting extra procs off of that. That's a great place for Prowler to go. Werewolf by Night very often already goes in that list. And of course, there are still move strategies that are a little bit more mid-rangey that can be interested in this card. But what I will say is, for a card that I was so excited for, I feel like it's a little more the king of tier 2 than it is tier 1 busted amazing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think a good analogy for this card is Kate Bishop. In much the same way as Kate Bishop is a card that creates cards, but is not necessarily the best 2-drop, nor is it the 2-drop that goes in everything, I think Prowler is fairly similar. This is a card that you want to play when you care about what the outputs are. You want to play this when you have a deck that wants skills, when you have a bunch of options and need to weave some stuff into your curve, when you want to play Werewolf by Night, when you want to play Zombie Scarlet Witch, when you want to play, I don't know, Nick Scratch. This is a card that scales much more off of being a skill generator, and that is much more of what this card is about than being a move synergy card, which I think is a really interesting way to look at how this card has released. Largely, there are good mid-range decks in the move subgenre. The Hydra Stomper deck is very good and can very easily play this, and it is fairly reasonable in there. The problem you run into is it ever better than doing something else? And how good are the outputs if I'm not doing anything specific with them? That's why he often gets grouped in with the cards that actually scale off of skills, as opposed to the cards that want him to be a move deck. An example of this can be found in the Ike Hawk version 2 list that we're looking at here. A pretty much just replace Kate with Prowler in this list, and then boom, bang, boom, there you go. You have a better Werewolf by Night deck. That is sort of level 1 of this card. If you're playing a Werewolf by Night deck, he is very, very good in it. Werewolf by Night, of course, will be able to move, meaning the cards will be free. You can use those cards for extra Werewolf by Night procs. They do not take up space on the board. That is effectively just absolutely free power. He goes in approximately every Werewolf by Night deck. And I think it makes sense that that happens. But I do think that there is like kind of a notable downside to being a Werewolf by Night deck right now. And that downside is when you have to be a Werewolf by Night deck, you have to pick an end game, right? And here, I think that this is actually a pretty good selection of endgame by Ika here, because it's specifically dodging Shadow King in a way that, say, a zombie deck is not. But it does give up power in order to do that. If you're going to be doing this Annihilus stuff or this Darkhawk stuff, you're explicitly saying, I'm giving up a little bit of power relative to the zombie package. I'm giving up some Prowler synergy in order to get this to be a deck that is not getting completely owned by Shadow King. The problem is you still kind of get owned by Shadow King. And the other problem is, since Prowler just came out, not only are there a lot of Shadow Kings just by the nature of what the metagame has been, there's a lot more Mercury because people are playing move stuff for Prowler. And guess what card also beats up your Werewolf? Mercury. And then you end up getting like in a position where it's like you have to win these games with Darkhawks. And no offense, but it's 2025 and it's really hard to win games with Darkhawks in 2025. This is a deck that demonstrates where Prowler is at, I think, pretty well, which is like, this is a solid deck that nobody is going to get mad at you for playing. You can absolutely succeed with it, but I find it hard to look at this and then look at what Victoria Hand is doing right now and say, I would rather play this. Like, that is sort of what a lot of these decks end up looking like, where it's like, this is good, there are points here, it's solid, but it sort of peaks at good. And I think that's sort of what Prowler is like. Again, the Kate Bishop analogy comes up, where it's like, is that the best 2-drop? No. Do you really play her in things that don't care about her output? Not anymore. We have better things to do if you're playing just generic good cards, and those kind of decks don't really exist anymore anyway. So you really only play her in stuff that cares about her output. And this card is very much the same. Big Baby Prowler. This is a very solid list from one Big Baby. I believe it was shipped over to Husky Puppies, who started popularizing it on Twitch. This is a straightforward Agamotto deck where, again, the major hook here is that there is a Werewolf by Night, and the other major hook is that Sam Wilson will make your Prowler free as well. So between those two things, you have enough input for this guy to matter, and enough output. Joaquin Torres can make remote mines into effectively 8 power. You can get extra energy off of the one that gives you extra energy, whose name I'm forgetting in the middle of recording this because I am a professional YouTuber. This is a deck that allows you to do as much with Prowler as you, I think, could reasonably do. That's a very reasonable thing to have. One of the things that really sticks out about this deck, though, and this comes up a lot for me with a lot of Annihilus decks, is I'd almost always rather Merlin the Sentry away than I would Annihilus it. It's a really notable thing where it's just like, I just never want to be actually doing that. I'd much rather polymorph it. I would much rather do all of that stuff with like images of Icon it or polymorph or whatever than I would Annihilus it. It is so much more useful to me as fodder than it is as a Viper Annihilus card, which is really interesting. I talked about that with Big Baby, and he ended up making a bit of a twist on this list. This is sort of the updated version, the V2, if you will, and it's just looking for power. It's just saying like, look, all right, the Annihilus stuff, it's not good enough. We're going to get some power out of this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use Prowler, Werewolf for power. We're going to have other stuff that does power with relative interaction here, and that's going to be enough. If you don't want to play Lady Deathstrike, I think you can try to play something along the lines of, say, I don't know, Cosmic Ghost Rider. But I think Lady Deathstrike doing double duty, cleaning up your, of course, hoods, if you actually need that to happen, is a useful thing to have. But again, a lot of the time it's just like, I want that there so I can do something to it. I have Merlin in this deck. I'm going to flip it away and get 2 energy. I'm going to polymorph it. Like, a lot of the time, I'm going to be able to do something useful to that. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time. That said, I think this deck, if I had to guess, is a little bit better than the previous one because it just has more endgame in it, more ability to do weird stuff, and doesn't rely on Annihilus, who is a card I am very low on at the moment. The zombies list that plays Prowler is something that is leaning as far into the outputs as it can possibly get. The cards that scale the best with skills in this game are Zombie Scarlet Witch and, of course, Werewolf by Night. And this is a list that is attempting to do both of them. The thing you run into, though, with Prowler here, and especially with Superior Spider-Man here, and with Mercury and Cannonball here, you have too many 3s to reasonably play all of them. Like, you just kind of do. Part of me really wants to take this deck and cut Superior Spider-Man for a Surge, not because I think Surge is better, but I just think that there are too many 3s in this deck and I care more about what Surge can get me. I realize that might be a little bit ridiculous in the deck that can actively turn on Superior Spider-Man constantly, but there's just a lot of things that you want to get on the board, and if you take your time to play a Superior Spider-Man, you're not going to get those on the board anyway. And I ran into that a lot. So I do think that when I played this list, one of the things that I thought would be a good idea is trying a Surge instead of Superior Spider-Man. I think that that could be a significant upgrade to this list because the 3s get in each other's ways way too much of the time. And that means that Prowler doesn't get to shine as much as you'd want, right? Because, okay, I'm doing like a zombie Scarlet Witch thing, but I have a cannonball in my hand, which means instead of playing Prowler, I kind of have to play Mercury on this like turn 4 or turn 5, right? Like that has to happen because otherwise I don't have Mercury Cannonball. And so you just end up sitting there looking at Prowler and it's like, yeah, I wish I could play you. And a lot of that is down to just how many threes that we have and when you want them to be played and how much stuff we have that generates things that like take up space in your hand and take up space, not space on the board, but use your energy and all of that. And so while I think Superior Spider-Man is a good way at trying to deal with that, I would rather play a Surge, which is just fundamentally a card that is cheaper and makes the curve slightly better. And I think that's a change that I would make in this list. Prowler, of course, is doing his normal thing of being better Kate Bishop. That's really what his job is here. The problem, of course, is that he costs 3. And frankly, anyone who's played one of these decks knows how awkward Kate Bishop can be in Merlin lists, and that awkwardness absolutely applies to Prowler as well. What I will say, though, I do like polymorphing Prowler a lot more than I like polymorphing Kate Bishop. I think going 3 to 4 is a bigger and better jump than going 2 to 3. I think a lot of people are playing this kind of thing with this guy, and I don't think it's like the wrong thing to do. It's definitely like a strong enough deck. I think largely where this deck suffers is in comparison to Victoria Hand pretty specifically, because you're both doing pretty similar things. You both have similar power outputs a lot of the time, but Victoria Hand has Shadow King, which is a card that turns off approximately 80% of the output of the stack, right? Like this is a deck that is doing Sam Wilson Craven, it's doing Batroc, it's doing all this stuff, and it just gets absolutely housed by Shadow King. And so you play those mirrors and it's just like, I don't want to call them unwinnable, but they're not fun, right? Like, and not literal mirrors, like just mid-range on mid-range here. When you play this deck against Victoria Hand and they're doing good stuff, you just get Shadow Kinged in one lane and then they have stats in the other one and you just don't beat them. Like it's really notable, right? Like luckily you do have Hydra Stomper who gets even bigger with a Prowler, frankly. Like this dude gets big because you have the ability to like, you know, move things around with Silk, right? It's like Silk gets extra procs. The extra spells that you get, skills, I'm sorry, they allow you to prevent yourself from being screwed over by Silk pretty well. There's a lot of thinking about positioning that you have to do and ordering in turns where it's like, where do I want my Silk to end up? How do I put things in such a way that it doesn't end up in the place I don't want it to end up, but also I get as many procs for my future Hydra Stomper as I possibly can. This list works. I don't want to act like this list doesn't work, and I do think he might be an upgrade in it. The problem is what you're giving up, and what you're giving up is an interaction slot, right? This card would have been, let's say, a Cosmic Ghost Rider. And again, not the end of the world, but it does leave you a little bit more open to things happening to you. And that is a real point of concern. I've also seen people running around with some Scream versions of this. I think that is largely a little bit short-sighted. I like the idea of being favored in the mirror. I think that's dope. I think it's cool. I think it's like, obviously, if you're playing a lot of Prowler mirrors, this is going to beat the hell out of the Prowler mirrors, right? That's awesome. Scream is that good. What I worry about specifically is matching this up into Victoria Hand, which just sort of feels like it is stronger and does more, giving up the sort of top end that the Cannonball Mercury provides you, and the fact that I'm not actually sure Scream is better into these mirrors than just playing a Mercury. I think it could be. I think it probably is, but it also requires you to have it a lot earlier, I think, and that does matter as well. I think that this is a reasonable way to try to go about it. I just think it's sort of lacking some oomph at a time when oomph is at a pretty high priority in this metagame. And don't get me started on getting Shadow Kinged in your Scream deck. It's not good. When I think about Prowler right now, I think of him as like the king of tier 2. It's very hard for me to call this card bad. Like, I don't think he's a bad card. I think he's a good card. But I think he's sort of capped by what he goes in. Like, if you remember when Kate Bishop came out and she was just kind of in a lot of stuff because there wasn't a lot of competition for her at 2, and she just got to shine as like a pretty generically good 2, that obviously like there were things that you wanted her for her synergies in, right? Like you'd play her in Wiccan, so she just helped fill up your curve with a 2+1, so you'd be able to curve into Wiccan. You played her in, you know, V-Hand because she had created cards. You played her in Clog because she could clog stuff, right? But you'd also just sort of see her around. And I don't think it's Prowler's fault that that won't be true of him. I think that is much more indicative of where the game has come in the months since Kate Bishop's release, where it is a very different game in that year and 3 months now, like year and 4 months, actually. I think that the fact of Marvel Snap currently is that if you are not investing heavily in your synergies, you will get outdone by people who are. And this applies not just to people who are fully comboing you or whatever. It applies to like a V-Hand deck that is invested in synergy while still playing tech. And for the record, I've talked about V-Hand a couple times here. I don't think V-Hand is unbeatable. It's just really good against every Prowler deck, right? Like it's just really, really strong into that kind of stuff. And that is ultimately something that is awkward for his positioning right now. In light of that, I wanted to throw a sort of untested but potentially interesting brew here. This is something that a couple of people have been working on. Derek and Smiz and myself have sort of been thinking about the idea of a Professor X version of this kind of deck. And here's where I'm at currently. There are a couple of different ways to try to go about this, but I generally think that this list is something that has some upside into a metagame that can be a little bit combo-y. Trying to lock down lanes in a way that is totally asymmetric, right? Like you get to move your cards in, I have a Mercury, they don't. The zombie package, of course, with Zombie Scarlet Witch, Zombie Giant Man, Zombie Mr. Fantastic. So maybe you lock down the zombie lane, preventing people from Shadow Kinging into it, and then you have the ability to add power to it later. Lots of stuff that is potentially powerful here. Of course, you can always move Wolf into the Professor X lane with the Prowler skills. That is sort of the baseline of what this deck is trying to do, because you can still play skills in that lane. That's largely what this deck is trying to do, and I think it's a pretty interesting direction to go in. Wanted to highlight it at the end because unlike the other ones, not something I have personal experience on, much more of a theory craft, but I hope it does help you. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest, you have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.